and less like NATO. And I've heard that myself, and I know you have too. And I'm wondering whether that links up with what the general thinks. Tell us how these kinds of recommendations and these issues from the inside. What's the discussion like, and where are we moving?
Well, first of all, I want to thank General Allen and his study team for coming to NATO last month. We had a really good discussion about the report, about where they were heading, and I think it really is going to be a very important continuing driver for discussion. But I want to say a lot of the issues that have been raised have been front and center at NATO now for some time. Let's take this matter of how we speed up the acquisition and incorporation of technology, new technology, into how NATO does business and into how NATO and its partners engage, whether in the worst case in combat or in just ensuring that we are able to fight terrorism effectively, do everything that NATO is going to be doing around the world. And the recognition is very clear that we have a lot to do. We just completed, actually, external advisory group did some work to try to think about how to streamline and facilitate based on kind of today's superstructure for decision-making on procurement and acquisitions in NATO. Frankly, they have some very, very good ideas, but it's going to be a bit of a barrier to get up and over to change how NATO does business in these areas. But I think the recognition of the problem is there. That's always the first step on the road to fixing whatever problem you've got. But I think it's very welcome to have from the GLOBSEC study group this very, very astute but also well-formulated list of drivers, because it will really help to shape thinking at the headquarters and among the nations as we're contemplating further adaptation of the alliance.
Mr. Foreign Minister, you are sort of on the front lines of a lot of these questions, along with your fellow Baltic ministers and governments. A couple of years ago, you talked about how nervous you were. This was sort of a common theme from folks from your region. Have the kinds of conversations that General Allen and that Rose are discussing that are going inside NATO and in Brussels, have these reassured you at all? Is the kind of stuff that NATO is doing, the kind of steps that are undertaking to adapt to the new environment, made you less nervous? Are you still very nervous? Tell us how you're feeling. How does it look from Lithuania?
Good morning, everyone. Very good. Very good to be back. NATO is the strongest alliance in the world history, and still it is, in spite of everything. But let me start by also paying tribute to Zbigniew Brzezinski by a few sentences. He was not only strategist, great statesman, friend of Baltic states. I'm really proud to know him. But he was also, maybe many know, passionate hunter. And during hunting, once in Lithuania, he shot 2 boars and called them Molotov and Ribbentrop. It's good to remember, because
very good to remember.
in my view, Molotov is still alive, and looking for his Ribbentrop. So that's for the beginning. Then when it comes to the adaptation and what was just presented, all these priorities, I probably have to say a few words about, well, particularly our region.
Of course.
And definitely this has to do with very simple things. On the one hand, simple, and on the other hand, quite complicated, because we have to address capability gaps, which is really obvious. And it's not done per one night. It's not done in short term, but it has to be done, and it's being done as we speak, by the way. I have in mind very concrete things like air defense capabilities, simple presence. Also, when we're talking how to deny, well, let's put it bluntly, Russian access denial, it's important, but the best denial is presence of ours. So that's the best denial, and also we have to take into account. Also, what we would like to see, frankly, we started with discussions in Wales and Warsaw to speed up decision-making process. Again, it's easy to say, but complicated machinery, many allies, consensus-building process needs time, which is with all respect, but we have to do much more in order to make this really happening in more speedy way, because crisis is not waiting. We have to be active. And therefore, it's related, and I see good group of military authorities, former, current, they should be given more authority. I understand that there was time when they had almost unlimited authority. Then it was, of course, political supervision is important, but they have to be given more authority in order to prepare political decisions when crisis comes, and that's also the case. Talking about our region, it was some time when we discussed, do we need defense plans, do we not? That was the case, and this gradual response plans are important, but we should have standing defense plans with attributed troops, which also nothing special, basically, but this is a must, we can do. And again, I'm saying this, given these propaganda noise around, when our friends Russians, they're very gifted to swap sides sometimes and accuse others what they're doing themselves. Because now they're saying that taking response measures, what NATO is doing, which is really those who are not even experts, it's by far nothing to even to compare numbers of troops, generation of forces, number of exercises, snap exercises or whatever, it's nothing to compare. And while saying that NATO is not going to compete or escalate, which is not our task and goal, but no one should doubt that we will do everything what is necessary to protect our territories, populations, and our countries. And that's really, now as we speak, this is really not just momentum, but the time, very crucial, decisive, I would say, and I would, in brief, would say these would be tasks of the alliance, in particular in our region.
Oftentimes when we talk about NATO's present, NATO's future, it's sort of 30,000 feet. It's a very abstract question. We're lucky that this week it's very much on the agenda, not just here at GLOBSEC, but of course in Brussels. We just had the summit. I want to ask you sort of all two sort of questions related to this summit and your impressions of it. One is, all the people in this room have read the news accounts of it, and we know the sort of conventional wisdom takeaway from it, and I want to get your response to that, and then I want to find out, what are we not hearing enough about? What's going on, the substance of meetings that are happening that sometimes doesn't break through to especially my beloved colleagues in the media. We're often chasing the shiny objects. But let's talk about those shiny objects for a second, because they're particularly shiny right now. Here's what I would say is the conventional wisdom takeaway from this week's summit, and I think it's very well represented by something that Fareed Zakaria wrote. And here's what he wrote. He said, if you were to construct a Russian plan for what you would like the American president to do to undermine NATO, it would look something like this. He would go to NATO headquarters and publicly highlight divisions. He would berate other members, and he would refuse to very clearly affirm America's commitment to Article 5, collective defense. Well, President Trump did all that. That is sort of the message that you're getting. If you read the major newspapers and watch the cable news, that this is the biggest story. I want to get your response to that idea, to that image, and then we'll talk about what's underneath it. Let's start with you, Rose.
That was inevitable you'd start with me, isn't it?
It's just because you're right next to me, that's all.
Fareed is always both pungent and colorful in his commentary, and I've always enjoyed reading it because he does capture so much. In this case, though, he's a bit off, and I actually wanted to talk a little bit about the mood music in the room on Thursday night. There's no question that there was some blunt speaking from Mr. Trump, but what really struck me, and this has not come out in the press at all, was the degree to which leaders around the room set aside their prepared remarks. Some of them took some time to jot things down. Some of them just spoke directly from here. And they talked about the value of the NATO alliance very directly. They talked about its value as basically a bulwark of the principles for which all of our countries stand, members and partners, always working in that direction, talking about the value of both democratic institutions but also the rule of law. And now, you know, I have to stop saying I'm new to this job. I've been in the job 8 months, so I've seen 2 ministerials on the defense side, 2 on the foreign policy side, and this is my first leaders meeting, heads of state and government meeting. But among the 5 meetings, this was the most direct, extemporaneous, and I would say heartfelt discussion that I've heard. The meetings are always useful. We get a lot of business done. You've all sat in on these meetings. You know how business gets done. People make announcements of things they're offering up. Very useful, very important, very, very, I would say, necessary for the continuing engine of the alliance to keep ticking over and moving the alliance forward. But this was a heartfelt discussion, and it was an important one, I think, in terms of making it clear that the Allies get it. They truly do get it when it comes to having to pick up their fair share of the burden. And I actually looked back this morning. I too threw away my prepared remarks for this morning. You'll be relieved to know. But I looked this up this morning. It says, the blunt reality is that there will be dwindling appetite and patience in the U.S. Congress and in the American body politic writ large to expend increasingly precious funds on behalf of nations that are apparently unwilling to devote necessary resources to be serious and capable partners in our own defense. Not my words. Robert Gates, June 2011, his final statement to Defense Ministerial of NATO. I'm sure many of you were there. So this has been going on for a long time, but the alliance did have a wake-up call in 2014, aggressive action of Russia in Ukraine, seizure of Crimea, action in the Donbass. After that, and along with it, the rise of ISIL, seizure of Mosul. So that was a wake-up call, and the Allies are stepping up. So I would say we need to have a continuing debate. There needs to be a continuing drive. The kinds of technology developments that General Allen is raising with his team in his report are going to take significant resources. So we have to keep our eye on this prize. But I wanted to say I found that discussion on Thursday to be a heartfelt one, I'll use that word again, but very direct, and the way in the best of meetings, the discussion should go.
Linus, basically what I think Rose is saying is that this is the message that President Trump was delivering is one that has been delivered before, perhaps in a slightly different way, but the same message. And I'm wondering, from where you sit, is the way it's being expressed today more effective, less effective?
I would suggest not to focus on some single statements or what was said, what was not said, because it was even not a summit, to be precise, right? It was a special meeting. So it was not just with whole spectrum of meetings and the margins of that, as usually, and foreign ministers, defense ministers were engaged. So it was just first encounter. So to expect that everything will be said maybe would be not realistic. What also I'd like to say, I value very much process, not just statements. And when I was asked at the beginning, before elections, after elections in the United States, are we scared? Are we so to say, confused, whatever, or frustrated? I said, look, let's wait. Let's be patient. Let's, things will settle down. And now I can tell really, very bluntly, after 2 visits to the United States, after the elections, meeting all key officials, National Security Advisor, my colleague Secretary Tillerson, Speaker Ryan, chairmen of the committees in Congress and in Senate, I'm really assured 100%, and the meetings were excellent, and the points raised were very exactly what we'd like to see along the lines we're thinking. And also, let's admit, presence of American troops on our soil also is a fact. It's not a statement, it's a fact.
And the defense budget rollout, or
and
the national budget, but defense
also
billion additional.
More resources for presence in Europe. So let's look at facts, and also my advice would be let's look at ourselves. Are we really doing enough? Or just looking who is guilty, who is doing not enough? That will be very important for our alliance, for cohesion, for burden sharing, for everything. And now really more easy to talk to me because my nation was always lagging behind with regard to the defense spending, not anymore. So we increase this dynamics is the best among NATO now.
Well, let me ask you about
can be really very powerful union if we'll really work with each other. And these investments, what US does in Europe, it's investments also for US sake, you know. It's really time to make our Euro-Atlantic alliance great again.
The problem is it just doesn't fit on a hat. You got to get it to fit on a hat. That's the key.
No hats.
Rose, go ahead.
Well, I actually wanted to pick up on a point that General Allen made, because it was a very important part of our discussion also on Thursday, and that is the way the alliance is coming together in the fight against terrorism now. And SecGen likes to say that we have been in the fight against terrorism since 9/11 and the invocation of Article 5, and that was front and center again at the memorial dedication on Thursday. I hope before too long you'll get to our new headquarters to see what both the Berlin Wall and the 9/11 and Article 5 memorial look like, because they're in a magnificent setting and really speak both to the challenges of overcoming the Soviet Union and ending the Cold War, and our approach today, which is to continue to defend and to have a strong deterrence relationship, to defend against potential aggression, but also to begin to redouble our efforts in the fight against terrorism. And that's the meaning of this action plan that we put together, and that is now something that all of the Allied leaders agreed. They agreed 2 reports on Thursday. One was on counterterrorism. The other was with regard to defense burden sharing and redoubling, reemphasizing the necessity of fulfilling and implementing the defense investment pledge from Wales 2014. So those are both now firmly agreed. There are in both cases plans that will be fulfilled to move forward, individual plans on the defense burden sharing side, and on the other side then, of course, together we are working on the counterterrorism struggle, honestly, and it is going to be a generational struggle for everyone in this room, younger people, those with the green halyards on, and those of us who are further along in our lives. Let me just make a comment, though. I wanted to open up a little bit also about this notion of counterterrorism trumps Russia. Isn't that interesting how that verb gets used a lot now in the English language, but everybody considers it so delicious they have to use it all the time. But it is part of the debate that's been swirling around. Is there too much now on the fight against terrorism, and are we forgetting our defense and deterrence requirements and challenges? And I just wanted to, again, take us back to dinner on Thursday. And I wanted to give you a feel for the richness of the discussion around Russia and the challenges that Russia poses, and the fact that we still have major challenges in dealing with the situation in Georgia, in Ukraine, now the Western Balkans taking more front and center. We're all concerned about what's going on there. There was a real seriousness to that discussion, and I wanted to assure you all, anybody who's been concerned about this matter, that in fact there was a strong recommitment to the Warsaw decisions with regard to our dual-track approach, deterrence and defense, and dialogue with Russia. It was a strong discussion, it was a rich discussion, and it was a very good discussion. So I would say now we have 2 major balls to juggle. I mean, always, there are significant challenges ahead of this alliance, but we can engage fully and strongly in the fight against terrorism, do it in a more comprehensive way than we have done in the past, but also confront the challenges to defense and deterrence that a more aggressive Russia poses to the alliance.
You know, one form of adaptation we haven't discussed, Rose, yet is enlargement. Mm-hmm. And you just mentioned Ukraine and Georgia. I'd love to hear your thoughts on where does that issue stand? Are those just completely off the table now, given the realities? Was that part of the discussion? Was that something you were hearing about?
Oh, absolutely. And let me just say a word about this Twitter storm. You know, honestly, we are missing an historic moment by getting wrapped up in this Twitter storm over the Montenegrin Prime Minister's encounter with Mr. Trump. On Thursday, Montenegro was welcomed as an incoming ally to NATO. We can't yet raise its flag, but it was welcomed as an incoming ally. For the first time, the Prime Minister addressed the heads of state and government in a leaders' meeting, and it was greeted twice with an extemporaneous, spontaneous eruption of applause, once during the handover ceremony, and once after we heard the Prime Minister at that table. The leaders all gave a very strong round of applause. And I just wanted to underscore that because this is a country that has really, really had to do some heavy lifting. They had really serious and difficult problems of corruption. They had to pull a reform program across the finish line to be ready for NATO membership. They did that. And then, as it was coming to the finish line, almost the end of the day last fall, there was a serious coup attempt to try to derail the whole process. So this country has done so much to deserve NATO membership. And I think we're missing this historic moment through, all of the brouhaha that has surrounded what happened on Thursday. So I just want to say to this audience, I hope when their flag is raised over NATO on the 7th of June, that you'll help us celebrate. It's an historic moment. It truly is. And yes, we did talk about what else needs to be done. There are other countries in the Western Balkans, Bosnia and Herzegovina, former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. There are, efforts afoot to work with them as well. They clearly have a lot of problems these days. They need to look at what they need to do to complete some political process, to complete some reform processes. We will continue to work with them. And I wanted to say two things about this matter. First of all, countries, whoever they are, Ukraine, Georgia, the countries of the Western Balkans, they must have the right to choose their security relationships for themselves. This is a basic principle upon which NATO operates, and we must continue to press that matter. It doesn't mean that they need to be only working, in one direction. We have no problem if a country is working with Moscow and working with the NATO alliance. If that's their choice, so be it. But they must have the right and the ability to choose their security relationships for themselves. The second point I really wanted to stress is that NATO's door will remain open, and that is a firm both principle and policy for the alliance.
General.
And the partnership process is also very helpful as well.
Yeah, thank you for raising that.
Because it helps to prepare states that are interested. It creates a very visible and tangible relationship between NATO and other states as well. So it's not just membership enlargement, it's also the partnership program.
Let me stay with you, General, and I wanted to ask you, Rose brought up this issue of how do you balance priorities between you talked about these driving factors, the threat from the east, and then you described it as the threat from the south, and an internal threat. This was the kind of issue of terrorism, failing states, and refugee flows, and then Salafi Jihadist threat from inside Europe. What's your read of how the organization has balanced those two priorities, and how would you tweak it if it were up to you?
I'm not sure I can comment specifically on how I'd tweak this. I'm not dodging the question, but I would simply say that NATO is in the process of adapting.
Okay.
First thing, of course, is that I think NATO very well acknowledged the challenge last year in Warsaw and set for all of us who either observe NATO or participate in NATO, set for us the tasks necessary to do this. But I think in ways we've never seen before, we have a confluence of challenges and threats that require us to think differently. For example, we do know that Russia has engaged in an active program of influence, desinformation, maskirovka, and other activities, along with cyber intrusion, cyber attacks, that have specifically targeted the democratic institutions of states in Western Europe. So that in some respect is about weakening the institutions and the capacity of those states to be resilient. So that is one line that's moving across the interior of NATO and Western Europe. The second is the fact that Russia is engaged in the south in an environment where we seem, it is not foreseeable right now that one of the 4 civil wars in the region in which Russia is actively engaged in fighting, whether we'll ever see a resolution to that in the near future. But what we can anticipate is if this continues to deteriorate, there will be more waves of migrants coming to Europe, another line directed towards Europe as the migration of millions of people threaten to fundamentally change the social fabric of Europe. And then we have another line which is converging in Europe, which is the line explicitly of the so-called Islamic State and other terrorists who are attacking in the heartland now, perhaps to relieve the pressure on the core area in Syria and Iraq, but perhaps just simply because they believe they have the capacity today. Weakened institutions, large migration flows, enhanced terrorist activity along terrorist and criminal networks. These are all converging lines into Europe in ways we've not seen before. And I really think the third is going to become a more prominent line as time goes on. So are we in NATO, and this is just a rhetorical question, it's not intended to be critical in any way, are we in NATO seeing the convergence of those lines in a coherent way that can drive us in terms of our decision-making process, in terms of our willingness to work closely with the EU and other states to share intelligence, to share information, to support law enforcement, to have special operations capabilities poised and ready to go to help a nation that is struggling at a moment of crisis? Are we thinking in those terms? And I think in terms of agility and adaptation for the realities of what we face in the future. Just that alone, those 3 converging lines from the east and from the south and from the inside are ways that we should be thinking.
Mr. Minister, when you hear discussions like this of balancing priorities, I'm assuming, perhaps wrongly, you correct me if I'm wrong about this, that in your country, the focus is primarily on this threat from the east, that the idea that NATO should be focused on Russia and all the kinds of things that General Allen has just mentioned. What's your read of whether the organization's priorities are in line with the reality of the threat?
No, we should address all threats, south, east, and using this term 360 degrees, which is not just for fun, but it's really true. We cannot solve one crisis at the expense of other crises, and nobody asks how many crises can erupt at the same time, but we have to be capable, ready, and that's the point. But talking about priorities, adaptation in particular, also this term is very good. I believe it deserves to mention, at least, we didn't mention yet, strategic communications, resilience. This is also war. And instead of artillery attack, we have brainwashing. And this is taking place everywhere. And if you think that this is only applicable to Eastern European countries or those under the influence of Russia, you're quite wrong.
Oh, I know it's not because in the United States we're seeing it too.
It's applicable to Western Europe, everywhere. And it's underestimated for a long time. I remember our discussions when we discussed at the beginning in the midst of European Union, for instance, and the first reaction from some colleagues was, look, it's censorship, it's freedom of speech, alternative points of view. I said, yes, but I'm always saying and repeating, lie is not alternative point of view. It's really
What about
different.
an alternative fact? How about alternative facts? Is that acceptable?
No. Facts, I agree, but if you're deliberately lying, spreading lies, brainwashing audience, be it before annexation of Crimea, be it whatever, this is a weapon, By the way, talking about costs of our missiles, you're shooting missile, which is quite costly, better if it costs less than target, right?
Right.
That's okay. But in strategic communications, you can shoot many times, basically, if you're prepared, if you're really doing that in proper way. We really underestimated that for the wrong time. And I also would like to say, where we have to pool resources, it's also an issue for European and NATO cooperation. It's also the case. We're talking about the same threats, basically. But we still not capable to address in proper way. Even coming back to the substantial capabilities, when we have, for instance, rapid reaction forces, right? We have in VGTF and RF in NATO. We also have battle groups in European Union, and as we all know, so as former defense minister, I can say I was always dreaming to have the same set of forces for all, regardless which flag is European Union or NATO, but it's important to have the same. But in fact, we have the battle groups never never used at all. Let's be frank, for some political reasons or whatever. But we still not competing, but maybe not duplicating, I hope, but still having this autonomous developments. Here is really something we have to look at very seriously. It has to do not only with the efficiency of our activity, but also with respect of money of taxpayers, by the way, why we should duplicate these things. And you know, maybe somebody has these illusions in their discussions that we're having some autonomy and that means the superiority one against another organization. It's not the case. We really have to take it very, very seriously. But my main point why I wanted to jump in was definitely this resilience with regard to the strategic communications, what we are still losing, in my view. We can win this war, but we are still losing for the reasons unexplainable. Maybe not enough resources, maybe not enough manpower, maybe something else. But this is really something very serious, and we have to adapt ourselves to this.
I want to just ask the audience to start thinking. We're going to turn to questions pretty soon. Start thinking of what you want to hear from our panelists, things that I haven't asked, things they haven't brought up. But General, you had a finger up about that.
The minister, I thought, has made a very important point, and it's easy to conceive of the competition with the East in physical terms, in terms of physical forces. But the reality, of course, is something that the Soviets did very well, and the Russians have carried on the capability. It's to operate effectively in the information sphere. And so the question we would need to ask ourselves is, are we organized adequately in the information sphere, both to sense the Russian influence operations, what the minister called information operations, but are we poised to sense it, and are we organized properly to be able to both deter and defend against it, and ultimately, if we have to push back against it? One of the things that we realized in the context of the International Security Force Assistance Force in Afghanistan, the NATO force there, was we actively organized ultimately into an information task force, because when you decide to move troops or tanks or aircraft, that's a physical asset that you have to move, and it takes time to move it. But if you're able to sense the information sphere, you can move capability in the information sphere at the speed of light. And so there's great capacity for us both to sense and contest the information sphere. We need to be thinking about that. Otherwise, we are simply going to be swamped over and over again with these waves of disinformation or alternate facts or fake news, whatever it might be, all of it magnified by trolls constantly across social media. If we understand this and we can organize against it, we can also then operate effectively in the information sphere. And it's yet another area where NATO must be capable of adapting. And I think NATO is well on its way to thinking in those terms.
Tell us more about how it's adapting to that.
Yeah, I wanted, first of all, to build on something General Allen said, but also to give a lot of credit to Lithuania, because many of you are aware of what happened last summer with this case of Lisa in Germany, the young German-Russian girl who was evidently raped by a migrant from the Islamic world. Very, very led to a lot of political difficulties, even protests, marches on the street. Well, lo and behold, some months later, another situation with a 13-year-old Lithuanian girl this time, raped by a German soldier arriving in Lithuania to take part in the formation of the battle group. Well, the Lithuanian media was very astute on this occasion and said this looks suspiciously similar to the Lisa case, which was proven to be absolutely false. Looked at this case with a critical eye. I think the government was very helpful in that regard in dealing with the public on this. And in the end, it was diffused rather quickly, as I understand, because everybody said immediately, this looks fishy. It looks too close to the case from last summer, which was proven to be false. So the only point I want to make, building on what both the minister said and giving credit to Lithuania in this case, but also General Allen, we are learning and learning fast. And we are responding, I think, already better than we were, but we can't ever be asleep on this matter because these attacks are coming hard and fast, and they are adaptable. They adapt to different circumstances, and of course, the public still needs to be, I think, brought along to be a lot more critical in how they look at events when they come across either social media or conventional media. So, and I think We've been and Jens Stoltenberg is very good about this, appealing to the press to say, look, you need to help us to be more critical about these stories that come in. It's up to you to help, but I think we all need to be alert and do what we can do to help as well.
All right, I'm going to open things up to the audience for questions. People will come along with the microphones when I call on you. Before I call on anyone, though, I do just want to remind everyone to please ask a question, not an observation, not an argument. Please ask a question. We have a font of wisdom here on the stage. We want to let them get to your points. And, don't be that guy. Please don't be the one that I have to say, hey, ask a question, okay? All right, we'll begin here with the lady in the white sweater, please. Please tell us who you are and ask your question.
Thank you. I'm Anna Wieslander with the Atlantic Council, Northern Europe. And I would like to bring in the partner perspective to this discussion. We have Sweden and Finland through cooperative security and international missions being very close to NATO, and that has continued also as NATO has moved towards collective defense, and not least in the Baltic Sea security setting, that has been very important. But how close can we go if we look ahead now for NATO when it comes to partner cooperation in this context?
Who'd like to take that question first? How much closer can we get? How much more involved can the partners?
Well, I'll start perhaps, and I think everybody's going to have a view on this, because I wanted to say Sweden and Finland are really among, they are among our closest partners with extensive cooperation every day. We're involved together in Baltic air policing as one example, where we are all working together day in, day out on this important matter, but furthermore doing a lot more training and exercising together, and there will be a significant exercise coming up in September that Sweden is hosting, but many NATO countries will be involved in it. So the relationship is already very close, and I think, in the end, it gets back to the point I made earlier about how close do those countries actually want to get to NATO. That is also a decision for nations to make in their own domestic settings. So there's a limit. The outer limit of membership takes you so far, and the outer limit of partnership takes you so far. So in the end, there are decisions that have to be made about how far to go.
Can I also?
Yeah, would you like to please?
If I may,
I'd like to come in.
Yes. Okay. Everyone.
Our region, I have to say.
Yes, I understand.
Because we value very much our partnership, and I have to say we can come as close as Sweden decides to come. That would be short answer, because we would really be very happy not deciding anything for Sweden, but we really would be very happy to have as close as possible, because they are very active in diplomacy, in our missions, NATO missions, and the quality of their participation, it really doesn't need to be commented. But also would like to say, although de jure they are not allies, but they are really allies. They are allies, they are not neutral by far when it comes to the developments in the region. And I can say that from another format, which is Nordic-Baltic, was very valuable for us. We all remember this, mathematics when it was called 5+3, right? 5 Nordic, 3 Baltic. Now it's naturally became Nordic-Baltic 8, basically. And we appreciate very much that, so it's a courtesy of our Nordic colleagues in inviting us with all aspects of the cooperation, including security, in this Nordic-Baltic family. So we really would like to have Sweden and Finland definitely up to your decisions as close as possible.
General, do you want to say something?
I do, and I think the partnership potential is enormous for NATO. Again, when we think about the environment in which we exist today, especially the environment of that is generating so much instability in the South, the NATO partnership with Arab states is extremely important, because they provide both valuable insights, I think, back into Brussels and Mons on the security and the stability environment in there, but they also can become platforms as NATO seeks ultimately to extend stability into that region. It's very important. And also, Australia has been one of the great partners, I think, that we could have imagined in the NATO context. Not only in their performance on the ground in Afghanistan, their performance, it's not a NATO mission, but it's in the context of the counter-ISIL coalition. But also Australia has the capacity, based on where it is located, to provide us enormously valuable input with respect to East Asia, where this report will, when it finally comes out, we'll talk about the role of NATO, specifically with China, in fact, and the dialogue with China, but also Australia's views on China as well. So I think the partnership aspect has unlimited potential for NATO in conjunction with just its 29 members.
Next question, we'll go to the gentleman here, white shirt.
Well, thank you. Giray Sadık, Associate Professor. My question is relevant perhaps more to Deputy Secretary and General Allen. You touched upon the counterterrorism and NATO. Well, in new NATO strategy to keep NATO strategically relevant, where do you think counterterrorism cooperation between the allies should fit better? Two short suggestions, and I'd like to hear your take on that. One, don't you think NATO should be more proactive, especially considering the evolving hybrid nature of threats? And number two, about the definition and allied consensus on counterterrorism. To what extent do you think NATO should only restrict itself with the jihadi element, or should it broaden to capture the concerns of all allies in the picture and have a more effective, strategically relevant alliance? Thank you.
Well, it's a very good question, a very important question. One of the things I would start by saying is that you know, the last time the NATO strategic concept was updated was in 2010, if I think that's right. But in any case, that's a long time ago, and much has happened since then. So it may be, in the context of a 2018 summit, time to present this as a coherent intention with respect to NATO's strategic concept, countering terrorism. I think in the context of not just the internal directional driver for Europe and NATO, that it deserves greater attention in the context of providing cooperation at the top level between NATO and the EU. But I think there is capability here, and remembering that internal security of NATO is a sovereign national issue, which largely remains in the hands of law enforcement. How we at the top level, at the super level, can provide the flow of information between the NATO and EU, and then down into sovereign states to help them as we get indications, warnings and indications. That's an important role in the future. Also, NATO has the capacity, working closely with the EU, to help counter-terrorist forces or counter-terrorist capabilities, or what we might use in a law enforcement term, special weapons and tactics units, so SWAT units at the law enforcement level. I think there's a lot of capability that can be harvested because between the cooperation of NATO and the EU and the states of the alliance. But I also agree terrorism is not just a Salafi Jihadi phenomena. There are lots of other terrorist entities out there, and increasingly it's difficult to tell the difference between a terrorist entity and a criminal network. And in fact, we know, I think, as we study this more closely as time goes on, that the lamination between terrorist networks and criminal networks is sometimes so blurred it's impossible to tell the difference. One day they're conducting a terrorist attack, the next day they're robbing a bank to provide their supports, the next day they're kidnapping someone for ransom. It's all criminal activity. Sometimes they justify it in the context of their terrorist objectives, sometimes it's just criminality. So it's a very important law enforcement dimension to this as well, and I think we need to be able to understand that. And then finally, in terms of countering terror and then the counter-terror mission, we have many of our partners, not members necessarily, but partners outside the NATO area that are really beleaguered by terrorism constantly and terrorist attacks. And this is where NATO can be very important to them in helping them to understand the environment in which they live and helping them, not doing it for them, but helping them to create the security platform within those countries that can create the capacity for other governmental development, capacity development, so on. So there's a lot of room for NATO, I think, to do this. And I don't, as I think through this, as I inventory this, the menu of things that NATO can do, these are not big ticket issues either, frankly. These are areas that can be done organizationally more so than with large procurement requirements and that sort of thing.
Let me just add very quickly, that was a very comprehensive answer, but I wanted to re-emphasize the point Linus made a moment ago about NATO's 360-degree approach, and this really counts in the counterterrorism arena as well as how we think about deterrence and defense in the alliance. So the problem here now is filling out some of those capabilities, especially as we redouble our efforts to focus on the challenges from the South. Part of what we have agreed in recent months is the so-called Hub for the South. How are we going to fill out that capability and use it in the most effective way possible to fight terrorism? We just, a couple of months ago, went to Kuwait and opened a counterterrorism training center there, one of the goals of which will be to provide a platform for training to really wrestle with some of these problems of the emergence of violent extremism and the results of violent extremism. So it's an issue now, and this picks up on the point General Allen made about not, high-ticket items. We're not talking about the development of big new technologies in many cases, but we're talking about going to the countries and saying, hey, can you help us with voluntary national contributions? Can you help us with trainers? We've had good success, and that was one of the outcomes of the meeting on Thursday, good success with countries now stepping forward to help with training missions in Iraq, and we are just delighted about that, and Slovakia among them, just delighted about it. So really, I wanted to, again, appeal to this audience as you're working in capitals to think about how, on the human capital side, the allies and the partners can be helping more.
Okay, we'll go to the gentleman here with the bow tie in the second row.
Yes, good morning. Konstantin Eget from Moscow. My question is about, not directly related to security issues as such, but it's related to sanctions against Russian officials. We've seen the United States accepting the new ambassador who is on an EU sanctions list, new Russian ambassador, and then we had Igor Sechin opening a huge Rosneft representation in Germany, actually a sister company, Rosneft Deutschland, in Berlin, with the promise of kind of $500 million investment in Germany, and he's on the US sanctions list. Do you envisage, and by the way, it's for the panel, whoever cares to answer, do you envisage this gradual slackening of sanctions, and return to business as usual? Because these two, to me, seem to be signs on both sides of the Atlantic that these lists don't really matter anymore.
Anyone want to take the sanctions question?
No.
Are you saying no, the answer is no, or no, you don't want to take it?
No, I'm just saying
No.
no. The answer to Konstantin's question is no. I don't see any slackening.
Can I add
Of course,
a few
please.
more words to this one?
Do you also want to say no?
Konstantin von Egert, he was also some week ago, right? In Vilnius, we had, close to Vilnius, we had Russian Forum. Mm-hmm. And was wide representation from Russian civil society. Those who still can be in Russia, they came from Russia. Those who not, they came from all over the world, and it was really very interesting dialogue. By the way, it's part of the dialogue we agreed within the European Union among the selective engagement, resilience, sanctions, dialogue with civil society. It should be done, really. And I'm not going to talk about this forum, which is another subject, but just on sanctions. My take was, from the discussions with these people, exactly about this individual sanctions. They said this is really must be expanded, must be used. It's really influential. It has the impact, and we are going to do that. We know how it's easy to reach consensus, but I believe we really have to take it very seriously because it's the only leverage we're using to press Russia. Or Kremlin, to be precise, right?
Do you feel the sanctions are working well?
If they are not working well, let's add sanctions.
Okay. Should we?
I believe we should, but it's not so easy to do, as I said. But to lift would be really big mistake, and I believe we will not do that.
Okay. Rose, you wanted to...
I just wanted to add one word. The new Russian ambassador to Washington is a very capable diplomat. He was my counterpart at the negotiating table for the New START treaty, and apparently he's now been confirmed by the Russian parliament, I think it's a good choice.
Okay. Next, the gentleman here in the corner, please let us know who you are and ask your question.
Jonathan Isle from Roos in London. I think my question is directly to Rose and directly from the previous question. You've had a lifetime experience of dealing with the Russians. You don't need many lessons from others about how to deal with them. You mentioned the two-track approach to dealing with Russia. Do you believe that we have in place all the instruments for dealing with Russia at the moment? Do you think we require new thinking in NATO, or do you think the new thinking is required only in Moscow?
Well, you know, we have a lot of experience, both as individual members of the alliance and inside the alliance as well. So in terms of new instruments, I don't think so. It's really important to think about what instruments we pick up off the table. And this question goes for both Moscow and I would say for Brussels NATO headquarters. The emphasis that we have had inside NATO on our NATO-Russia Council discussion over the last 4 sessions, I participated in 2 of them. First of all, on Ukraine and NATO's very real concerns about Russia's aggressive actions toward Ukraine. Second, and this is interesting, Russia brought this to the table, Afghanistan, and what's going on in Afghanistan. It does give us an opportunity to, I think, question Russia about their view of what's going on in Afghanistan. I know you've all seen concerns expressed in the media about Russia's current interactions with the Taliban. I share those concerns, but it's an opportunity to talk about them at the NATO-Russia table. And the third area, which I think is very important, is incident response, the necessity of looking for ways to build predictability and confidence between Russia and the NATO alliance, because over the past couple of years we've seen so many incidents in the air over the Baltic Sea, at sea in the Baltic Sea, and they continue. Again, Linus can talk about those, even with regard to commercial shipping. It's a very, very difficult and I would say preventable situation. So frankly, what I would like to see in the NATO-Russia Council is an intensification of actual work on incident response and problem solving in that arena, building up that predictability and mutual confidence. And there I think Moscow could take a good hard look at what benefits they might enjoy from being a little more focused and enthusiastic in that regard. Because as a matter of fact, it's, you know, in the interest of NATO countries, but we also see it as a matter of mutual interest. They should be concerned about preventing incidents that could affect their security going forward as well. So that is what I would say, Jonathan, in answer to your question. Thank you.
Right, we have the gentleman immediately to my right here, please.
Thank you very much. Stefano Stefanini, former Italian perm rep to NATO and participating as a writer, right? To the NATO adaptation exercise. I would love to ask a question to Minister Linkevicius about the decision-making process in NATO, especially reminding a side discussion we had at a time when it was actually Lithuania holding up the consensus. But no, I want to address a question an issue that General Allen raised. The nexus you mentioned, or converging lines between counterterrorism and mass migrations. The G7 is going to come up long on counterterrorism and short on immigration. That's a battle of Taormina, which is being lost by Italy on that matter. Do you think that NATO can somewhat correct this balance? If you think that there is a strong nexus between the two, and what you and I are strong believers in partnerships, what partnerships can do in this regard? Thank you.
General?
I thought that was to the minister.
Is this, yeah, who were you asking specifically?
My question is to General Allen.
Yes.
Writers don't get to ask the steering committee. No. Well, I think, you know, there's lots of ways that that the issue with respect to migration I mean, it's one of the hardest problems that Europe is facing right now, and of course, by and large, or by extension, the alliance. NATO having a role in those countries that are potentially fragile or failing states to assist those states in improving the security platform, which then provides for capacity building at the national level, whether it's judiciary or whatever it might be. That's a way that NATO can have a role specifically in helping a state through an advisory mission or a security assistance mission, not a fighting mission, to provide that state the capacity for stability. And every one of those states that goes over the side, if you will, every one of those fragile states or failing states that ultimately fails, I think we all know that that's going to create another wave of human migration, because they've all seen what's happened in Europe. And so many of these migrants, and we can argue about why they came, whether they were economic migrants or political, fleeing political situations, or they are in fact migrants because of a horrific wartime situation. Nonetheless, they came by the millions, and it has not been lost on many populations across North Africa. And I have to tell you, we need to make sure we're paying close attention to the Maghreb and North Africa, because there are millions of disaffected young men and women in that part of the world as well, where the states have borderline capacity to provide for their futures. And as those states become more fragile, and as the pressures on their internal security mechanisms become greater, this is an important role that the community of nations broadly, the European Union can be of assistance, but NATO can have a specific hand in helping those states to stabilize themselves so we don't end up with another 2 or 3 million migrants coming in. So I don't think NATO is going to have necessarily a role in blocking the flow of migrants or channeling the flow of migrants in the European context. I believe that's something more for the EU and the individual states to have to deal with. But in terms of NATO extending stability, I think that's a vital mission, frankly. And it's not counterterrorism, it is helping those states themselves to change the human condition by having a security platform within which its own governmental capacity building can occur. That, I think, is one of the best ways. It's a long-term objective, and Rose called it a generational issue. It is a generational issue. But if we don't get at it, we know that in the South there are many fragile states, and some of them are failing. Every one of them is going to generate migration. And if we can stabilize them 1,000 kilometers from Brussels, then everyone benefits, the people, the state, and ultimately the Atlantic Alliance.
Great. Yes, the lady on the end of the platform, the edge of the row there. Yes, thank you.
Neelam Dev, I'm from Gateway House in Mumbai, India. There have been some passing references to China, and I just wanted to ask what the thinking is. NATO has been in Afghanistan along with the United States for decades. A few days ago, it was reported that the Chinese expressed displeasure with a US ship that went close to the Spratly Islands near the Philippines. So, and of course, there's a battle group near South Korea. So what's the thinking on NATO participation in the Pacific Ocean in other parts of Asia? Thank you.
Thank you for that question.
Again, I'll just say a few words to start. My colleagues probably have some comments as well. NATO really does try to maintain good lines of communication with countries in Asia. In terms of geographic spread, I don't see NATO spreading beyond where its kind of natural territory is. But I think a good dialogue with countries in other parts of the world is very important. General Allen mentioned in his report they are looking at the potential for broader communication between NATO and China, and I think that's very worth looking at. We've long had a history of communications with the countries of South Asia as well. To this, at this current time, we have military staff talks with Pakistan, which I think are helpful in the context of our continuing work as the NATO alliance in our resolution support training mission in Afghanistan. So I think from a NATO perspective, we welcome those lines of communication being open. We think it's beneficial, but there are limits. General Allen, do you want to pick up on this?
You hit it very well, I think. The one thing I would hope we're thinking about would be, the environment in Northeast Asia is pretty tense right now. I don't think we really understand Kim Jong-un's intentions. I'm always very careful not to ascribe to someone like him that he's irrational or not a rational thinker. He's thinking in the context of his own value system and his own national interests. We think he's poised potentially for a sixth nuclear test. He's constantly firing ballistic missiles off in a provocative way, whether it's to intimidate the new president in South Korea, we don't know. My point is there is a hair-trigger dimension to the security environment of Northeast Asia, and I think it's not inappropriate for NATO to think through the process that if suddenly war broke out on the Korean Peninsula, what are Article 5 implications in that regard? Should that war be an aggressive war that's launched from North Korea to South Korea and American forces in the region come under widespread and long-range ballistic missile attack? I'm not proposing that we would invoke Article 5, but I think we should think through the potential implications of that.
A question at the very back row, please. Yes, Natalie.
Yes, thank you. Natalie Nougaret from The Guardian. I wanted to ask you about the European Union's contribution to stability and security around Europe. We're talking about NATO, of course, but I wanted to note that Donald Trump went to Brussels, of course, to visit NATO, but he also actually visited EU institutions, which got less attention. And I think I remember that Obama actually visited Brussels EU institutions only 2014. I'm not saying Trump is more EU interested in the EU than Obama is, certainly not. But I think that there's a symbol there that we haven't really dwelled on. And although your focus is obviously NATO, and although the EU-NATO debate has been going on and on for years, which comes first, that's not my question. My question is, at this point, with Britain pulling out of the EU, with apparently a new Franco-German couple trying to build up some kind of new dynamic on the continent, and because we can basically use all the tools we can get to stabilize our environment and to stabilize the continent, what are your thoughts today, including Mr. Minister, on how the EU, how EU member states, as part of that club, can contribute to stability and security on the continent, alongside NATO?
I welcome that question very much because in this setting we haven't had a chance to talk about NATO-EU cooperation. I've been, again, impressed in my 8 years, it feels like 8 years, it's been 8 months, in my 8 months of this job.
We all know the feeling, yeah.
Even in this short period, how much NATO-EU relations have matured, because we had at our foreign ministerial in December the signature of a statement launching famous 42 proposals. These are joint NATO-EU proposals for cooperation, many of which are focused on the fight against terrorism. And I wasn't there. Sandy Vershbau's here. He could probably talk about this in more detail. But I understand in previous years, it was really hard to get cooperation off the ground institutionally. The two institutions tended to be butting heads, including down through the staff levels. And what I've seen in these 8 months is, and thanks to the fact that we had a very firm and clear at ministerial level joint agreement in December to begin working together in a pragmatic way to implement these, and a focused way. I think that was part of the problem. These are very focused, these 42 proposals. It has resulted in, I would say, much better institutional interaction and cooperation. And we are now approaching the defense ministerial meeting in June, and you'll see progress report at that time. But just watching it from the inside and knowing about the history, not having been present, but knowing about it, I constantly am reflecting on how far the two institutions have come in their cooperation over the past 8 months. So I welcome it very much. I'm glad you opened the topic today, and Linus, you may
Yeah,
want
Mr.
to
Minister,
comment.
what would you like to add? Yeah.
With pleasure. Definitely, as you said, this joint declaration really like fixed the situation, but also envisaged what we are having in the future, and really very good personal contacts, very important. Secretary General, High Representatives, and these meetings, I remember from my time also, were very short, to be precise, and with little substance. And now we have much better. Although it was always very good cooperation on the ground. Maybe institutions were talking not very good. But the EU is quite efficient in the worldwide arena, I would say, with the development cooperation with the humanitarian assistance, which is also, who can argue, a big part of stability, of security as well, and good potential for the future. I also would like to mention UK. You said UK is leaving EU, but really, as far as I understand, UK definitely, by far, not leaving security cooperation, and it's our task, and we have to keep them as close as possible to EU basically, but also to European affairs, to the security affairs, which is also a position of UK as far as I understand when talking to Boris Johnson, and he's very keen to, and the UK is saying that they will be even more active than they were before. We will see how it looks like, but it's reciprocal. It's also from our side. So we shouldn't just sort out and to say that UK is leaving, because at least from my point of view, from Lithuanian point of view, or Baltic states, the UK was always very close ally in whatever aspects, be it United Nations or NATO or European Union. So I hope and believe we will preserve this partnership and cooperation. And this is also a linkage between Europe and NATO, because UK was always and still will be very strong proponent of our strong, so to say, cooperation, Euro-Atlantic cooperation. I believe we'll continue the same speed and the same spirit, although in different capacity.
Let's take one final question. We'll go to the gentleman on the end of the row here.
My name is Radan. I am from United States of America, and I have following question. You know, we deal with migration and terrorism, and we will deal with that for decades to come. And President Trump was kind of vocal that without a war in Iraq, which create ground for ISIL, which led to all subsequent problems, the situation might be different. So my question is, rather than NATO being reactive and dealing with situation what we have, do you see a mechanism, opportunity to be proactive to prevent the situation which led to huge displacements of immigrants, which led to terrorism being introduced to Europe and so on? Thank you.
Sure. If our only solution to terrorism is fighting, then we're going to be fighting forever. So we have to fight to defend ourselves. I don't think anybody questions that. But if that's the only way of dealing with terror, then that's the only way we'll ever deal with this. And you can't fight your way out of a terrorist problem. You can't kill your way out of a terrorist problem. We have to think more broadly about the causal factors of why someone would be willing to join an extremist group and blow themselves up at a concert. And that means we have to swim upstream, if you will, in the chain of human events that creates, in the end, a suicide bomber. No child in the world is born a terrorist. Something happens in the course of human events in that child's life that creates a moment and a trend towards something we'll call radicalization. There's lots of radicals out there. But when you've become radicalized because of the insufferable human conditions under which you and your family have lived, absence of human rights, absence of justice, absence of access to education, absence of economic prospects, when you've become radicalized, you're really just one step away from being a recruit for an extremist organization. So I worry about solutions that deal with what we call violent extremist organizations, because we're already late if we're dealing with VEOs. We, as a community of nations, have to diagnose the problem and get upstream from the symptom. The symptom is terrorism. The problem is the radicalization of millions of young men and women around the world today by virtue of the human condition in which they live. Some of it is propagated by radical imams and mullahs, but much of it is a function of the human condition. NATO has a role in helping to stabilize nations that are, in some form or another, in difficulty. as a result of their own internal situation. NATO can provide, through security assistance and advisory capabilities, the security platform in that country through which then the resolution of human condition can be undertaken. But this didn't start last Tuesday, and it's not going to stop next Tuesday. This is, as Rose properly said, and we all have to gird ourselves for this. This is a generational issue. But if we don't get upstream and deal with the causal factors, the solution cannot be interminable war against terror, because that's the symptom of the bigger problem, and we have to get after that.
I think that's a great place to end on an interesting point, and I'd like to thank our terrific and distinguished panel for a really interesting conversation. Thank you to the audience as well. Thank you, Rob.
Thank
you. Ladies and gentlemen, refreshments are available just outside in the foyer. Please let me remind you to be back in your seats here at 11 for the GLOBSEC debate with Senator Ron Johnson of the United States and with me again. At the same time, in the Danube space just outside in the lobby downstairs, there's a discussion of the GLOBSEC Future Forum about countering terrorism. Thank you very much.